Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate them at the table. I'm Alex.
I'm Lex.
I'm Jimmy.
So today we're joined by special guest Jimmy. Jimmy, could you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a game developer from New Zealand, and I play RPGs. I've been playing them since university. Met Lex through the Pretending to Be People Discord not too long ago, and have played a great game of.
Music from a Darkened
That's the
Room.
one. Yeah.
Happy to have you here.
Yes, wonderful to have you. Nathan and Holly couldn't make it to this episode because they are performing life-ending surgery on a patient. So let's see what's on the slab. The case report for this session is the Necropolis, which is a scenario written by Leigh Carr for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. In this scenario, investigators are thrust into a survival situation to escape a mummy's tomb. As with any dissection, we'll be discussing all the gross innards of the scenario, so from this point on, there will be spoilers. So if you're interested in playing this scenario, please stop here and share this episode with your GM so they can listen and consider running this for your group. We'll also include links for where you can purchase a copy of this scenario for yourself in the show notes of this episode. Now, with that out of the way, let's begin our dissection. So how do the PCs get involved in this scenario, Lex?
Basically, they are a group of an archaeologist, a professor of languages, a dilettante, and their bodyguard. It's 1926, the height of the craze for people to raid out the Valley of Kings, to pillage, to discover all of these artifacts buried in tombs, to bring to museums and personal collections. The various breach-ends have some good backstory hooks for reasons to be insistent on looking for some kind of new dig, and they come across this one that is apparently different. The scenario actually just starts them off inside after the door has slammed shut behind them. There's not a whole lot of exposition for how and why they got there, but they are trapped in a tomb and need to escape.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward from what I understand. They go into the tomb and then they get trapped by the workers that were trying to help them. Because some of them might be cultists, they might not. It's up to the keeper to decide.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, this tomb was built to worship the Black Pharaoh, an avatar of Nyarlathotep. And inside the tomb is a big monster called the Abomination, which is then released halfway throughout the scenario when the investigators poke and prod a little too much. So could you tell me about the tomb, Jimmy?
Yeah, the tomb itself has a number of rooms that the players will explore their way through as the scenario goes on, each of which, in its own way, will tell the players about the abomination and the being that it worships, and hopefully give them enough info that they can find their way out. So they start off in a long passageway with crumbling walls, which has some, I believe, frescoes along the walls. Give them some detail there. And then they'll come to an antechamber filled with treasures plundered from all kinds of different places. This is sort of like the central room of the map, and everything sort of branches off there. Then they can find a nice little annex with a dead German guy. Noteworthy that there's a dead German guy in a tomb that was supposedly undiscovered. Finally, when the abomination wakes up, there's also a room that it will force its way out of, containing its sarcophagus, and a further room, a treasure room, which contains not just some nice treasure, but also the one way to defeat the abomination.
A treasure room, which is different than the other bigger treasure room.
Of course.
Yeah, different treasure.
Yeah, this one of the high points of this scenario to me is that it has a very nice GM and player map that you can use as players are going through the scenario. Since it's supposed to be very dark and crushing, what I tend to do is have some printouts of the map and then expose just little bits of it at a time as they're making their way through it. So even though it seems a bit small on paper, I have found that it's a pretty satisfactory size for players to go through over the course of a couple of hours. The passageway also has some mummified dogs that are behind the kind of crumbling frescoes on the side, which I have always had players try to rip the walls apart. Every time I'm like, oh, it's starting to crumble. No, I got to see what's back there. And then freak out at mummy dogs that don't do anything.
But what if they did? We'll talk about it during the reanimation.
I've never had players actually go into the crumbling walls with the mummified dogs, but I still found ways to bring the mummified dogs in.
Very nice. So it really seems like there's just that one big NPC, the abomination for this scenario. But I can imagine that there's also the option of having the workers and like the other pre-gens if there's less players, right?
Yeah, that's sometimes I will try to flesh out the beginning and the setup of the scenario a bit more, but it's hard because it sort of needs to work like a cutscene where you can introduce it, but bottom line, the PCs need to be in the front of the thing. So if anyone says, I'm just going to stand and watch, well, then this just got difficult. And then if you have a smaller number of players than there are pre-gens, make that pre-gen an NPC to follow them along and use them to get ganked by the abomination first to show that you maybe don't want to run straight into combat.
Or you could subvert it and have the PC get ganked and then they get to control the NPC.
That's actually something that I did before. The last time I ran this was just for 2 players, and so I gave each of them control of 2 sheets. So it was the dilettante and their bodyguard were one player's responsibility, and then the 2 academics were the others.
Very nice. Could you tell me more about this abomination then, since it's the main threat of the scenario?
Yeah, the abomination is a priest or servant of the Black Pharaoh, one of Nyarlathotep's many avatars. He has, I believe, symbolically or maybe literally sacrificed the Egyptian gods to Nyarlathotep, or at least that's what you're sort of told through the descriptions in the murals. And now he's living immortally in this tomb, trying to get out. The main motivations he's given in the scenario is to consume the players and to force his way out of the tomb. And yeah, big, scary monster, mummified, I think described as 7 to 8 foot tall, and with a weirdly wolf-shaped head, which is his main sort of beastly feature.
Right.
There's a lot you can do with that too. I like the idea that it's not just a wolf's head, but as a person's head stretched into the shape of a wolf's.
Oh, that's quite horrific.
Yeah, something else that I've done with my descriptions is that it is a wolf's head, but it's a man's torso that has been stretched and torn. And so it's filled with this kind of smelling, rotting black ichor. So like as the skin is stretched and ripped open, there's this black that's separating out from it and dripping everywhere that it walks, like it's barely holding on to its current shape.
Mechanically, this thing's a beast.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's built for, even though it's size 90. However, it's got like crazy damage. So these pre-gens, right? They only have 10, 9, and then one of the ex-soldier has 13 health. And just mechanically, this thing has 80 fight, so 80% chance that it succeeds on a hit if you don't dodge or fight back. And it does 3d6 damage with its normal unarmed. So what that means is it does 10.5 damage on average when it does hit. So on average, the 3 PCs that don't have 13 health are just pasted instantly. And if it does decide to use its weapon, then its average goes up to 15 damage. So yeah, this is not something that the investigators want to fight head on. And honestly, it's a lesson. This scenario is a lesson to not do that.
And I think it's a good thing then for the keeper to keep in mind. You want the players to sort of know at first sight that this is something that's going to mess them up. You really want to sell them that strength, either when they see it, if they have some light, which, as we'll get to, they probably won't, or when they first hear it, you want to make sure they know this thing is big and strong.
I think something that works well is I always wait for the players to explore the antechamber and get through the main mural and the annex to get to the story about this thing, or read the dead German's journal, as like that can be a big oh shit moment. And then they hear this giant rock thud and fall because they're bound to have seen basically a boulder that's blocking up this door and realize there is no way they can move it. They can see that there is a door, but it's just blocked. So for this thing to slam it open, that's already a huge, we need to not be around that.
Definitely. That's a good way to choreograph it.
Because it happens sort of behind them and in the next room. So that's something that I really love about this scenario as a strength is since it is so dark inside, and as Jimmy hinted that their lighting situation is going to leave a lot to be desired, you can do a lot more as a GM by emphasizing the sounds and the smells and the feelings of being inside of there because the PCs are going to have to navigate without vision for at least some parts of the scenario.
Are there any other threats besides the abomination then?
Really just a cave-in if they fuck around too much inside. If the beast smashes a bunch of walls, which can cause it to collapse, or if they use the dynamite that is in the dead German's pack, then that can cause a cave-in and kill them and potentially the abomination with it.
So rocks fall, everyone dies.
Yep.
And really, just reading through this scenario, the keeper can just trigger that whatever.
Yeah, whenever you have another appointment, just go ahead and trigger it. Okay, well, thanks for playing. I gotta go. Bye.
Yeah, so it's either once the abomination awakens, all cards are on the table. They either get out or they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure I remember reading that the scenario has if the abomination also gets out, that's also something that the future PCs have to deal with as well. So besides the abomination awakening, that seems like it for key events besides them getting trapped. So what would we say is the beating heart of the scenario?
In my mind, it's about creating that sensation of claustrophobia, of really getting the players in that headspace that they are trapped, they are running out of both light and time, and air is another suggested sort of stick to poke them with, is that the air is getting stale, and that feeling that they have no way backwards, that they need to move forwards into this dangerous place. And yeah, they know they're playing Call of Cthulhu. They know there's going to be something terrible further into this tomb, but they need to go forward and learn more about what's going on to get out of all.
Fully agree.
Yeah, very nice. And we can find some ways to emphasize these themes later on. So, just breaking it all down, what are the strengths of this scenario?
It is dead simple. You are trapped, you need to get out. That's it. That's all it needs to be. There's your motivation, I think we said last time.
Yeah, it also highlights investigation in a different way. This isn't the players being given, free time to go to the library or the records or the newspaper to find information slowly over time. This is a situation where the players have to investigate and do so efficiently and cleverly if they want to learn how to get themselves out of this life or death situation.
And then I think, as I just mentioned a little bit ago, but since the scenario is so dark, you as a GM can emphasize other non-sight senses for players to experience and for their characters to navigate their way through this, which I find for especially new players for Call of Cthulhu is a really great different way to progress. So often in a lot of RPGs, it's like you see this, you see that, and players may not really be in the headspace of like you hear something moving, you smell something from the other side of the room, and that can help them get a lot more into that headspace with that verisimilitude. Also, it has loads of tips for GMs throughout. Again, this is my favorite starter scenario. And also, it has tailored bouts of madness, which is near and dear to my heart. Always love to see it because it makes every player character's freak out feel novel. And then great art that you can show. It's not often in scenarios that for the key moments, you have an art handout that you can share for folks in addition to the map to help them navigate. Really solid all around.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
In addition to that tailored bouts of madness, I find the pre-gens that the scenario offers are very strong because they're such like archetypal characters. If you're fans of this kind of like 1920s kind of almost pulpy exploration setting, then you sort of understand the dilettante and the archaeologist and the ex-soldier. They are solid media archetypes that you can then sort of easily apply tropes to make quite strong characters, even if you're a brand new player.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically just have your players watch The Mummy and then just go.
Yeah.
And on that note, something I also like about this is that as soon as you talk about it's the Necropolis, it's in Egypt, going to be around there, you're an archaeologist. Everyone is like, okay, great, it's going to be a mummy. So just by making this some kind of giant werewolf beastie is enough of a subversion of expectations that players are always like, what the fuck? I wasn't expecting that. It's been great.
Yeah, having a strong setting that the players can really relate to and imagine. Like everyone knows what a pyramid is, everyone knows what a mummy is, everyone knows what it like that stereotype image of going through a darkened tomb with flickering torches. So I feel like that is great for new players in order to put themselves in their PC's shoes.
Hmm.
But let's move on to some weaknesses of this scenario.
I have heard some folks complain that this scenario suffers from a lack of NPCs to interact with, as that can be sort of a key component for a lot of these investigative horror games. However, I would disagree with that, as I find the lack of NPCs in this scenario is helpful for brand new players, as they can just focus on getting the core aspects of the system down, exploring, getting in that head movie imagining space. And then you can bring in NPCs another time because new players may tend to not know how to interact the best. It's like I roll persuade. Great. Um, and then it just is another one. I wish that they did have a little more to the beginning and ends. It's written, like mentioned, that it can be run in an hour. I have never run anything in an hour. I introduce myself in an hour. So like I do wish that there had a little bit more that you could pad on to the beginning and end, but I think that that's going to be a focus for my reanimations on this.
All right, so before we get into reanimating this scenario, we'd like to contextualize our general experience, histories with the Necropolis.
Yeah, so I first heard the scenario played on the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast. I believe they did a crossover with the guys from Howie Roll, where they played through this at some convention. And yeah, the concept immediately grabbed me. I love the mummy, and like it's such a good sort of like here's some fun Egyptian 1920s horror, vaguely sort of exploration-y, pulpy, and then just with a very tight focus. I ran the scenario once, pretty much as written, though still with a longer runtime than the book would suggest. And then made some larger adaptations to run it with a group that I play with more frequently. The first game was fine, but the group itself didn't gel with Call of Cthulhu, so it wasn't as fun. But the second game was a lot of fun, and that was the game where I tweaked the rules, and I was playing with a group who already love to play with just the PCs bouncing off each other a lot, so the lack of NPCs didn't affect us at all. In fact, that's probably where they shine as a group.
Nice. So this is my go-to scenario to run for new players. I watched Seth Skorkowski's review of it back whenever I was also watching his videos on how to play and run Call of Cthulhu. And like you mentioned, Jimmy, the premise immediately hooked me because the mummy is near and dear to my heart. So being able to have that as a scenario, that's great. I think I've run this maybe 4 or 5 times. I've lost track. Just because it is simple to bring in some supplies, have an in-person game, and it's been a hit every time.
And personally, I have no experience with this scenario at all. But I would like to ask you to, out of all the times you've ran this, what's the percentage of PCs escaping or just getting slaughtered?
I've had one PC escape. However, that PC had made a contract with Nyarlathotep and had changed the abomination to his will to escape as the future big bad evil guy for a separate campaign. So I don't know if that counts.
That's wild. That's not part of the scenario. I will talk about it for sure.
That's a lot cooler than me. I would say I have about a 60% kill rate for PCs in this scenario, just because the abomination is a mean customer. But one, I roll like garbage when I'm playing creatures most of the time. And two, I do try to emphasize players having more of a cat and mouse. Like if they are trying to hide from it, I let that be a more protracted, tense scene. Because even though the thing can see in the dark, I don't want it to just Jason through the entire thing. So I want them to hide a bit and then the combat can be
And then
on.
it Kool-Aid Mans through the wall. All right, gentlemen. It's time for reanimation. So overall, how do we highlight this beating heart for the scenario?
For me, first and foremost, you make the dark oppressive. It's very easy for players to kind of metagame away the idea that darkness, total darkness is debilitating. Being blind is a real setback for characters who are normally sighted. It's one thing to say, I walk across the room to the doorway, or I go to this spot where I know it is. It's another to actually do that in total darkness. So I like to highlight the inaccuracy of players' senses, then mess with it even more. So, they say they walk over to the doorway. Maybe they don't quite make it to the doorway. Maybe there's a check to see if they can make it to that doorway. Or maybe they find themselves walking for far longer than they probably should without finding any kind of wall.
Ooh, I like that. And just hearing you talk about making the dark oppressive, if one were to ever run this in person, playing by candlelight, that's awesome. That would definitely help the atmosphere.
That is what I do every time. I will pretend like I'm just trying to get set up and I'm, a little bit scattered, walking them through. Yeah, so you're here, you're doing this, yada, yada, yada. And as the door slams shut in front of them, I turn the lights off in the room
Ooh.
and describe, you are in total blackness. And I typically have some props that I will keep in just a tote bag or an old backpack or something that I will set in front of the archaeologist player and say, like, you can dig through your bag, and they have 4 LED candles that have a little flicker effect. And so those are the candles that the archaeologist has in their equipment. And they'll need to use those to read their player sheets and, like, their dice and things. It's never so much that they can't see anything else because there's a little bit of light in the room, but I find that it nails an atmosphere for them every time. And also, whenever they say that they're going to hide in the antechamber or anywhere else and blow out their candle, I make them switch off their LED candle. So that way we're all basically role playing in more or less darkness. So I find that that helps everyone's imagination going, that they can think about those sounds and those smells that they'll be experiencing. When they come across the dead German's journal, I will typically just like grab the bag back, and I have an old notebook that I hand write the handouts in, and then take some old paper towel rolls that I Sharpie dynamite onto the side of, and then hand that back to them so that they have some more physical props. That's as far as I go for physical props in a game.
Oh, you don't bring out the dead German?
No, not yet.
All right, very nice. So, on the subject of like putting together this atmosphere, I imagine having ambiance would be quite good for being in the tomb as well. Just like the draft, the wind going through. Actually, no wind because it's collapsed, but
Mhm.
Yep.
just ambient noise, just creepy drones. I can imagine that to be very effective.
I'll also tend to run this with my laptop open so that they think I'm looking at notes. But as Jimmy knows, I love to use sound effects in games. So
Hmm.
there's often that I'll have like some falling rocks and rubble sounds that I will click every now and again. And then I will have like a heavy metal clang and then a thud. And if you've ever played Bloodborne, I have a clip of Vicar Amelia howling that I use for the
Oh,
beast in
Oh,
this. So then
that's
I
great.
play that from behind them.
beautiful.
It always works. It's so fun.
I'm more of a stick on a good video game or movie soundtrack kind of person. And I believe what I did for this last time was I started with The Mummy, which is, quite pulpy. It's high energy. It's not too bleak. And then as things get darker, I switched to All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a lot bleaker, a lot more somber, a lot more atmospheric, and then has this beautiful pair of quite loud, blaring notes that punctuate the silence every so often and really give players a jump. Uh,
That's always great. So, moving on. How are we gonna modify this scenario? Are we going to improve any plot points, add NPCs?
I tend to flesh out the beginning, and mostly I just tell the different PCs how they're feeling. The archaeologist is obviously crucial for this. So saying that they are on their last legs, if they come back empty-handed, their career is over and they're going to have to start working at a cafe. And the main Valley of Kings basically just looks like an antbed of all of these different teams and archaeologists that are better funded from the University of London and whatnot. So when the dilettante gets there's a small kid that comes up to them and mentions that there is a place that only locals know about, and gives them directions to the dig, but it comes at a price. So the dilettante can give the kid like $1, thinking that that was the price they were talking about. And that's what points them towards this other tomb. And they can talk to the locals. Some people were resistant to wanting to go there, maybe because they already had people at the digs, but another team shows up. And these were kind of the quote unquote cultists. To me, I imagine because there's also a dead German in there that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I roll this more as the cultists are there to feed this creature every now and again. And so they'll find a way to lure some people in. Maybe they're locals or other folks. But since there's all of these tourists and air quotes explorers around, that's a lot easier. So by finding a way to engineer a reason for them to open the door, get them inside and shut it, they're keeping Nyarlathotep's guard dog fed. Otherwise, he could bust out at pretty much any time. There's a great modification that Seth Skorkowski mentions in his review video of this, is that whenever they're at the dig, I usually have like the professor have an undergrad assistant who's there to help them for a grade on their course. They're like, oh, this is wonderful. This is a find of a century. Here, you all can go stand in the doorway and I'll take a photo. And so they droop their head underneath the old camera. And as they're holding out 3, 2, a rope snaps and there is a giant crashing thud as you are plunged into darkness and a wet, warm spatter goes across your face. Then I pause for a bit and then describe the camera light flashes to give them just a sight of a hand sticking out of red, sandy mud under the door. That's whenever they start.
I've also played with that, adding more to that intro, just letting them be outside the tomb for a bit, or even go back a bit further, as you say, and just have them like discover the lead or be fed the lead by the cultists and then get them to the tomb. There is that risk of someone just not going in the tomb, but I've actually not had that happen yet. So
nice. Okay, I don't trust brand new players that much because a lot of people are like, why would I go in there? It's bad in there. Like, you need to engage with the scenario to do anything. Okay.
Yeah.
Play the game.
It's something I probably wouldn't use with brand new players, even though this is a like starter scenario, but it is something I've done with like an established group who I was using it as like a fun little one shot for.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all very eager to just buy straight into let's rush into the tomb.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I think another one is for a mummy tomb. There's very few traps or any other threats as written. Seth also mentioned that in the spirit of Indiana Jones, he had poisonous snakes come down from the ceiling and mess with players a bit. I grew up on the 99 Mummy, so I have the scarab beetles are in the walls and it can like crawl under their skin and munch on them. They need to crush and kill. That's always a great initial threat that they may want to be careful and not blunder too much.
I also use some less active threats, but things that are sort of accentuated by the darkness. Loose patches on the ground where one could, if they're rushing, twist their ankle or fall in. And a small pit of what looked like sand, but was in fact funerary ashes that you could get up to your waist in and lose some time, which is quite precious when you've got only 4 candles to keep you going.
Mm-hmm.
The one big change I made was adding a more direct malevolence and a sort of evil spirit behind the darkness itself. The way I played it was, and this is something I improvised in the first session and then decided to codify for my second playthrough, is that if the players are ever in total darkness, the total darkness is serving Nyarlathotep. The way this would manifest is, in the simplest form, all sound would be muffled. The players would find themselves isolated from each other. Even if they're standing right next to each other, they might struggle to hear what the others are saying. It would sound distant. Then in each room, I introduced just like variations of what would be going on in there. In the opening hallway, which is described as quite narrow, the players might reach around and not ever find the walls, and instead just hear the whimpering moans of the mummified dog somewhere off in the distance, and the occasional crashing of the ceiling coming down in different places, far away, but always near enough to be of concern. And then, yeah, continued that in the other rooms. I had quite a lot of fun with the Ankh in the annex. There's a large golden Ankh on the wall amongst some rather key murals, and I liked the image of that just slowly, despite the total darkness, being clearly visible to any player in that room and slowly growing to fill their vision, just to spook them a little bit.
Creepy.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. I always, because they tend to be in that room with candles to read the one guy's journal, that I do a thing where it seems to reflect the light very, very well, especially for gold. And if they blow out the candle or go in darkness, they get that greenish after image. That's what causes those tentacles to kind of writhe in their vision just a bit. I do like that room because even just as written, the murals tell a really interesting half story that let the players fill in whatever blanks they need. The main thing they know is that there's a figure of a man with his chest ripped open and a wolf head getting put on him. And now there's a werewolf at the next room.
Yeah.
Not bueno. I think for the beast, I mentioned that I embellish the grossness of him and I give it a very distinct smell as well, that it's like this rotting flesh ooze is dripping out of it all the time, like its skin can barely hold itself together. If the players do somehow manage to, I've had them almost kill it once, but if they do manage to do enough damage to it that would incapacitate it or like knock a limb off, I have that ooze kind of writhe along the floor and start putting itself back together. Like even though the skin is tearing, it can't help but exist unless the jar is broken for the end MacGuffin. Something else that I do, because again, it doesn't make sense why there's just one guy in here and he's just skin and bones. I have him covered with the beetles. That way they've eaten all the meat off and he's just a skeleton. But with the thing, I'll add these disgusting black pools in his little room. No one's ever dug through it, but if they did, they would find a gold wedding ring that would say like J and W 1899 as like, yeah, he just eats shits and goes back to sleep like the best of us.
Okay. Right. So I think if I were to add an NPC for these players to interact with, because there is a lack of friendly-esque NPCs, it'd probably be like maybe a decapitated head that would give them hints in cryptic ways, just so you can have some interaction.
I think you could certainly do that with the dead German, who does have a name. I just didn't remember at the start, so we've been calling him the dead German. There's certainly room for that, especially as there's this theme of this immortality being bestowed upon the abomination.
Right.
And it's easy enough to then maybe the tomb can do that to other people who are not quite as willing or capable of moving around in their newfound deathlessness.
Yeah. It'd probably be like, Schrodinger's decapitated head, where if the players really need help, I might have it turn up and give some hints. But if the players don't, then I can do away with that. If I were to pulp this scenario up, I would add more traps, like swinging traps, stuff with a lot of motion. And I would probably also make the mummified like animals come alive to help. Although I would recommend against pulping this up strictly because it just takes away from the cat and mouse threat of the abomination.
There was another thought that I had. I haven't had a chance to implement this yet, but as I was just talking about that, I imagine the local cult is feeding people to this abomination. So I think next time I'm going to add slightly more modern chains are bolted to the walls so that they would chain a sacrifice between the two mummified guards at the front door of this creature. And like finding those on the ground would also be extremely bad vibes.
So one thing that I personally didn't get in this scenario is like what killed the German guy if it
Yeah.
wasn't the abomination, because the abomination is in its like casket thing and it breaks out of it unless it repairs it every time it takes a rest.
Right.
I understood that to be that there was a stone casket within layers of wooden caskets, and the wooden ones had broken long ago, but the stone one
Mm.
is the one that you hear just the slab moving off.
Oh,
But yes,
okay.
that is kind of unclear. And also, he didn't eat that German guy. He just sort of crushed him and then left him alone. So yes, there is some,
Didn't like the taste.
yeah.
He didn't like German food. Because there's a bit, even just rereading the last notes, it gives a bit of drums, drums in the deep. Because it just says, this place will not be my tomb. I can hear noises. Something else is here with me. But you're right that, like, every time that the beast emerges, it's crashing through things in this antechamber. It's knocking a lot of shit over. And then it just leaves the one body there, which is, as described, kind of like bones, basically, bones and clothes. So the meat's gone.
Yeah.
For this, I tend to say that there's a hole in the wall in that mural area that like he was trying to chisel his way out, and there was a cave in or a collapse. And so they see his boots are sticking out of the wall. They can pull, and like maybe there's some of those beetles that scrabble over off of it. So they pull just bones out. And he was trying to escape through there, but that's why the creature didn't get him. That's kind of the best that I can do.
And just spitballing, right? What if the creature didn't eat him because he had like an elder sign amulet? And of course, it didn't protect him. It just stopped him, made him untasty.
He has all of those necklaces that what was it Reggie had from the Mummy, where it's like
Yeah.
every religious
Yes.
Yeah. So
symbol.
I would add that. Just,
I would, oh, that would be so good, actually.
yep. And just on the subject of the abomination, I know we spoke on this before, but better ways to choreograph how strong it is and how much of a bad idea it is for the PCs to confront it head on.
Oh, what I do for that, because there's some weird things that are in this antechamber pre-treasure room, like there's a boat and there's a chariot and stuff like that. I describe the boat as being turned over, and I always have players scramble and hide underneath things. And as it is walking, I kind of mime the scene from Jurassic Park where like the T-Rex foot sinks down into things. I had it like sink down in front of a player as they were under a table, and it
Oof.
just tosses the boat across the room and they just hear it shatter. So enough to like show its strength as it is searching for these rats in its home.
Whereas to me, I had it happen quite naturally, where the players, on hearing this giant stone slab that seals the abomination's tomb, and I made it very clear that they had already passed through one of these stone slabs and that it was like the length of their body thick stone.
Mm.
So I had all of the players press up against it, have them roll this big roll against a greatly inflated strength score for them to represent them all working together. And then the abomination handily beat them in that contested roll. And just them feeling with all their strength and the weight of the slab, and it still inexorably moves outwards. And that was like, oh,
And you see it uses one hand.
Oh, a
yeah,
finger.
yeah.
Yeah. That's really great. You could also have the abomination just murder someone to show off its strength.
Oh, that always happens.
Yeah.
I love that the scenario gives you the trap options of they can pick up the weapons that the two mummified guards are holding in front because someone is inevitably going to try to bum rush it. And yeah, it's like backhand, only the person's legs are still standing there, then slump over because this thing is so lethal as written. It's one of the few times that I don't tone down an enemy in a scenario.
Yeah. I took inspiration of the description of the dead German having like a caved in chest. And for the one NPC who died to him in the second game, I just had him stand over him and press down
Oof.
and just leave a, like, if this was a Tom and Jerry cartoon, he'd have been accordioned out. But it was not.
But it was not. It's just blood and gore. Uh, I think we've solved some of that, the abomination coming out of the chamber and then going back in with your example of that sarcophagus boat. If it's already flipped over when the investigators enter the tomb, they're gonna be like, "What the hell already did? What did this?"
Yeah.
and that kind of explains, and maybe have some shattered jewelry or
Yeah, I think that you could definitely like break some of the furniture in the
Mhm.
room that they may think that it's just, oh, it's old, but like, oh, no, that's why everything is broken.
Right.
Yeah, I think I have described the first time they come through as like, oh, it looks like a rhino has wandered through here. Everything's askew and damaged in a way that suggests something rather clumsily and strongly shoving it aside.
And here's something that just occurred to me that I haven't addressed in all this time is like, if they're regularly bringing people to it, in the beginning, it has the German guy has chiseled through like a hole in this plaster or something that is
Mm.
between the entryway into the antechamber. I think on this note, I've never had anyone question that, but I would change it to kind of like a trap revolving door or something and have the German guy try to just chisel his way through the door. He knows he came through it, but can't figure out the mechanism for how to get back out.
Okay, so what would we want this to run like at our table?
It definitely is broken into three acts with me. The first, you're trapped, you can explore. The second, the thing emerges and you need to hide. And then the third is if they try to rush to get the dynamite or they try to break the heart of the thing. So that middle cat and mouse tends to be drawn out a bit more in my games because I find players really have fun with that. Then once they get on the other side of it, that's kind of the downhill.
To assist with facilitating the game, I would definitely print out that player handout of the map.
Oh, yeah.
I wouldn't add any grids to it, right? Because that like subconsciously
No.
tells people, oh, this is a battle map.
Never print grids in a Call of Cthulhu game because they're immediately like, oh, okay, I'm going to stand in front of it.
All right, I'm gonna stand 5 feet away and do an attack
Yep.
of opportunity and ah!
Yeah, I like even giving them the GM map is just so that you have all the rooms there, but like post-it notes or pieces of paper to cover up the rooms that they haven't explored yet.
Yeah, that's classic.
Hmm.
So, in our actual experience, what worked at the table and what didn't?
So yes, as I alluded to, my second game had a bit of a wild ending. This was because it was a standalone one shot that was part of the canon of an ongoing modern day Delta Green game. And I wanted to use this scenario to also set up some of the stuff that was going on in the background. And I also had this idea that maybe if one of the players decided to betray the others, then I could give myself a new NPC bad guy to use in that campaign who's lived this whole time. And what would you know? They did exactly that. So that was great. Um, the way it basically ran down is the players came into the tomb, they did the exploring, they learned about the abomination and the history, and also about the Black Pharaoh and its plans. And then while exploring the annex, I had this new space I had in mind, specifically for this scenario and campaign of if they did something, and I didn't know what at the start of the at the start of the scenario, but if they did something, they would find themselves basically in a one-on-one audience with Nyarlathotep. That happened, and I got to roll my first 1d10, 1d100 sand check. They failed and lost 3 sanity.
Wow.
So that was fun, and they turned on the players. But in the meantime, the other players who hadn't been isolated had, the cat and mouse game had started. The abomination was making its way through the room. One of them had found the dynamite and was trying to do some sneaky thing of getting up behind it to stick the dynamite to the abomination. And then the player who had betrayed the others decided, actually, I'm going to sneak on through, found the heart, used it to basically blackmail the abomination into becoming his servant, and everything just went downhill from there for the other players. It was an absolute mess in the best possible way.
That is so funny.
And the NPC who I intended to die to the abomination to show off its strength ended up being like, I didn't want to give him any spotlight, so he died kind of off screen, just while the others were having all the fun.
You hear from behind you, is that quicksand? Oh God. And that's
Pretty
it.
much exactly that, yeah.
I think most of the things as written in the scenario work great. I've had some players that hesitate a little bit too long in the first hallway for some reason. I'm really not sure why, but they tend to get very obsessed with pulling the frescoes and things down and saying like, is there any more? I'm like, it's the more and more of the ceiling is crumbling above you, but go for it. Um, then one time whenever I ran it, I tried to make the canopic jars a little less obvious. Don't do that because my players were very strangely confused. So like I even have like there is one that is dud 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 beating. You can have it glow a little bit just to be sure that they get that notion because my first group completely went past it. They're like, "Oh God, I'm gonna run away," and so they just tried to bury dynamite under the door and leave.
Silly.
One bit of advice I would give is be a bit more generous than maybe the rulebook suggests with the information, because that is the key thing the players need to get out of here. And in a lot of cases, it's kind of gated behind this pass or fail, roll a history check. And I tend to instead go for if you fail, it's going to burn more time and more of your candles, but you will get that information because otherwise this game is just dead in the water.
Fully agree. I completely forgot to mention that because it does ask you to like roll German to read the journal. It's like if you don't, you're fucked. So yeah, I love the idea that you still read it, but your candle is now half gone by the time you stumble through it.
No, I like that.
As for things that worked or didn't work, I'd say it all tended to work quite well for me. The best sort of scares I had were the playing with the darkness, or they light a candle, they realize they're somewhere they didn't expect they were going to be, or they blow out a candle and suddenly everything's a bit spookier or a bit further away than they thought. That was the kind of stuff that worked well for me.
Something that I also do, again, I make the more of a cat and mouse scene in the middle. So every time that the monster has come out, the players will douse their candles and be again in complete blackness. And so now they're fumbling to navigate their way through the room. I have them roll stealth. I give them a bonus, but anything less than a hard success, they're going to make noise because they can't see anything else. So like they still feel that tension. I give the thing like just straight up spot hidden rolls to try and find them. So that always leads to a great protracted scene because I give them initially a sand roll of 1 or 1d3 just to hear everything that's happening because that ain't right. You're not going to get 0 sand from that. But then if they ever see it in the light, I hit them with another sand roll for 1 and 1d6 to actually see it in person. So sometimes that'll lead to them having a bout of madness. My last run has been my favorite because they did not see the creature until the dilettante tried to attack it with I think he had a sword cane for some reason, or maybe I'm just remembering Alex. And that did not go well. He gets clawed in half, and it's like his lower half just slumps down on the ground in front of the bodyguard. And the bodyguard is pinned against the wall by this creature. And so I give him a moment like the mummy where he had 2 pistols and unloads both of the pistols into this thing at point blank. And I describe him seeing it in these muzzle flashes as it's bearing its jaws down on him.
That's awesome.
That like he almost kills it. It killed him, but that player was so satisfied he didn't even care. He's just like, Dane, I've done my part. It's all up to you.
I need to use that muzzle flash thing. That is so good.
I was so happy with that. Like it just came out. I'm like, actually, fuck yes, absolutely.
That is such an awesome image.
Oh, and one thing I did do with this that's not specific to this scenario, but it's the first time I tried it out, was for a one shot, instead of players just having luck recorded on their sheets, I actually gave them a number of coins, partly because I just backed some Kickstarter where I got a bunch of neat metal coins, where each coin represented 10 luck, just making luck a more physical thing that they were then like cashing in. I felt the players engaged with that a lot more than they normally do when it's just like counting off numbers. And it led to some great moments towards the end where the soldier was standing up against the abomination and just took his whole pile of luck coins that had been saving out the whole game, just emptied them into the middle of the table, said, I shoot it.
We hope our deranged utterings are helpful in bringing this game to life at your table. You can join the autopsy discussion on Discord and subscribe or follow the podcast to hear more gruesome cases. Be sure to check out the show notes for links on where to find the scenario, where to find us, and other links for things like handouts, actual plays of the scenario that we recommend, and other resources. So until next time, thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators.
Where your games can die
or live.
On the table.
I don't want to go back to work.